Okay, so now this cerebrum. We'll talk about the gyri and the sulci and the lobes. So, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It includes the cerebral cortex, underlying white matter, the basal ganglia, and the hippocampus. It has right and left cerebral hemispheres that are separated by a longitudinal fissure or like a narrow, deep split. The surface of the cerebrum has many folds that increase its surface area. The folds have gyri or ridges and sulci or grooves. Okay, the gyri are the bumps and the sulci are the deep grooves. A central sulcus separates the precentral gyrus that contains the primary motor cortex and the postcentral gyrus that contains the primary somatosensory cortex. Large sulci separate the cerebrum into lobes. The central sulcus lies in the coronal plane and it separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. The lateral fissure separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and also a bit from the parietal lobe. There are 5 lobes in the cerebrum. There is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, and the insular lobe, also sometimes called the insula. The names of the lobes and the bones of the skull are associated. So we learned when we did the cranium that there was a frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, the occipital bone, and then 2 temporal bones. And these lobes go with the bones and they're found in the neighborhood of these bones. The only exception is the insular lobe, which is actually sort of hidden in the little pocket between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. Okay, cerebrum, gray and white matter. The surface of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. Cortex is bark. The cerebral cortex is full of gray bodies and therefore is part of gray bodies, cell bodies, and therefore is part of the gray matter of the brain. Gray matter actually looks pinkish tan when fresh. So this is a fresh specimen in the picture here, and gray when preserved. Are areas of gray matter other than the cerebral cortex. They are called cerebral nuclei. And cerebral nuclei that are not in the cortex include the basal nuclei, which are involved in controlling motor functions. They also appear tan or gray. The white matter of the brain contains myelinated bundles of axons that carry sensory information, motor commands, or other types of information. The corpus callosum is a major bundle of axons that travels from one side of the cerebrum to the other side. It's a type of commissural fiber that connects the right and the left hemispheres of the cerebrum. And here it is in the picture. This is a coronal view, and we can see that it's going across from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. And when we look at it in a sagittal view, we see that it actually is very large. It makes a big sort of hook shape in the center of the brain, connecting the 2 hemispheres. The corona radiata and the internal capsule are bundles of sensory and motor neurons that travel superiorly and inferiorly within the cerebrum. They are a type of projection fibers. They are projection fibers, and they connect the cerebrum with inferior parts like the diencephalon, brainstem, spinal cord, and the cerebellum. Okay, and in this picture, the corona radiata are seen just below the cerebral cortex. They're going to be axons hanging down, sort of like dangling down from the cell bodies that are in the cerebral cortex. And then some of them would be crossing in the corpus callosum, and many of them would be passing downward through the internal capsule. Axons that travel from one area of the cerebrum to another area on the same side are called association fibers. And in this picture, they're red and tan, and you can see that there are quite a lot of them. And in this other picture, they're shown as blue. They're just kind of stylized as being small, but they are quite extensive. Okay, just of interest, most sensory and motor axons cross from one side of the body to the other at some point in their journey. Any significance to this is unknown. Okay, cerebrum sensory and motor areas are the next part. Much of the posterior cerebral cortex receives, processes, integrates, and becomes aware of sensory input. And much of the anterior cerebral cortex plans and sends commands for motor responses and any desired movements. It doesn't always have to be a response to sensory input. You could just plan something and have a movement. You could get up from a chair because you thought of something. The cerebrum receives sensory input into the primary somatosensory area, which we learned about when we were learning about spinal cord tracts, and also into olfactory, visual, auditory, and gustatory areas of the cortex. Sensation enters consciousness in these areas. And here we're seeing where those areas are. The visual cortex is in the occipital lobe. The auditory cortex and olfactory cortex are in the temporal lobes. The gustatory cortex is in the insular area, and that's all of them. The cerebrum processes and interprets sensory input in sensory association areas. And several of the sensory areas that we just learned about have large sensory association areas. So, for example, the somatosensory area has a somatosensory association area. The visual cortex has a visual association area. The auditory cortex has an auditory association area. And then the olfactory cortex and the gustatory cortex association areas exist, but they're actually more complicated to discuss. So never mind. But we can enjoy looking at how they have color-coded the somatosensory cortex with the somatosensory association area. They're both in blue. The visual cortex with the visual association area. They're both in green. And the auditory cortex with the auditory association area. They're both in yellow-orange. The cerebrum initiates motor commands in the primary motor cortex, which we also learned about in the spinal cord tract lecture. The premotor cortex, which is just anterior to the primary motor cortex, helps to plan movements and uses memories of learned movement patterns to help plan movements. And here's a little summary chart talking about the different lobes and their functions. Not the whole lobe, but the regions of the lobes, the areas of cortex in the lobes that perform a specific function. The frontal lobe has a lot of things in it, but just one of them is the primary motor cortex. So this is not a complete list of the lobe and its functions by any means. It's just kind of summarizing what we just talked about. Okay, cerebrum, basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei are groups of cell bodies that are deep to the cerebral cortex, and they include the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. That was a coronal view. If we look at a lateral view, we see that the basal nuclei have a complex three-dimensional shape, a bit like a shrimp, for want of a better explanation of the way that they look. The basal ganglia are the basal nuclei plus associated nuclei, including the substantia nigra in the midbrain that produces dopamine, which will come up later. Okay, so the basal nuclei are a part of the basal ganglia, and you'll hear those two associated terms. So just know that the basal ganglia have more parts than the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei have 3 parts, but the basal ganglia have even more parts. The basal nuclei help to control movements along with the cerebellum. They subconsciously modify voluntary movements, adjust muscular tone, and coordinate learned movement patterns. The basal nuclei do not initiate movements. They cannot do that. They just help to control movements. And here's a clinical correlation. Parkinson's disease disrupts the function of the basal ganglia. And this disease has shown us how important the basal ganglia are for creating movements. Because in Parkinson's disease, the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal ganglia, loses neurons that produce dopamine. And the unfortunate person develops slow movements, tremor, muscle rigidity, and unstable posture. Parkinson's disease is unfortunately very common. It affects around 1 to 2% of people over the age of 60. I included a little video here showing walking with Parkinson. The video is 2.5 minutes long, but just looking at 45 seconds gives you the idea. So I invite you to look at that because it is really horrifying what Parkinson's disease does to our movement patterns. Okay, so this cerebrum, the limbic system. The limbic system includes parts of the brainstem, diencephalon, and cerebrum. And you see here a list of the parts. In the brainstem, there's the reticular formation. In the diencephalon, there's the thalamus and hypothalamus, in particular centers that are associated with thirst, hunger, emotions, and their related behaviors. In the cerebrum, the limbic system has the limbic lobe, which in this picture is the pale green, and there are different parts of the limbic lobe, the cingulate, dentate, and parahippocampal gyri. But just big picture, the limbic lobe is the pale green. It's a sort of C-shaped, with the C facing the wrong way, C-shaped area of cerebral cortex on the medial, like if you look at the mid-sagittal section of the brain, like as if you've cut the brain in half, you'll see the limbic lobe in that medial area of cerebral cortex. Okay, then the hippocampus, shown here as this big pink structure. The amygdala, shown as this little purple sphere, and the fornix, which is this yellow connecting group of axons that goes from the hypothalamus, which here are the mammillary bodies, part of the hypothalamus, and here are other hypothalamic nuclei in purple, and the hippocampus. All right, so the fornix here, yellow, going from the hippocampus to the hypothalamus, which has, the two parts, just nuclei shown in purple and the mammillary body shown in red. The limbic system is involved with emotions, drives, thoughts, and associated behaviors that are linked to self-preservation and survival of the species. It links unconscious autonomic functions with conscious intellectual functions. It helps to store and retrieve memories. That's sort of the big picture. And now, speaking about some of the parts of it, the reticular formation has its role in the limbic system because the reticular formation is associated with states of arousal, alertness and excitement, or weariness and sleep. The anterior nucleus of the thalamus is associated with visceral sensations. The hypothalamus centers that are part of the limbic system are associated with pain, rage, fear, sexual arousal, and pleasure. The hippocampus plays an essential role in long-term memory storage and learning. And the amygdala is associated with fear, aggression, and survival. It's involved in the response to threats and contributes to learning from dangerous experiences. The sort of experiences that you have and that you don't forget, that you may say scar you for life, but also the memory of which protect you, hopefully, from more of the same dangerous experience. So let's say if you were bit by a dog when you were a child, afterwards you might be afraid of dogs because your amygdala would help you to learn that dogs are dangerous from your experience of being bit by a dog. Of course, you might be able to get over that, but in any case. So the fornix, it's attractive white matter that connects the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. And as I said before, it connects to the mammillary bodies, the nuclei, and the hypothalamus that control reflex movements associated with eating, licking, chewing, and swallowing. So what are the functions of the cerebrum? All areas of the cerebrum are used for one or more functions. There's not, extra parts that we're only using, 1% of our brain and all that business. No. All of the areas of the brain are used for one or more functions. Much of the cerebrum is involved in processing sensory input and initiating motor responses. It's also the site of all conscious thoughts and intellectual functions. Of course, these functions are not hardwired, they can be learned and changed over time. Consciousness, the ability to be aware of internal and external stimuli, thoughts, and emotions, cannot be easily assigned to one area of the cerebrum. Decision making is an interesting function of the cerebrum. The prefrontal cortex helps us to set goals, consider risks, make decisions, and plan responses. And actually, this area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, does not fully develop until the early 20s. So up until then, an individual might have trouble considering risks, let's say. They might think that they were safer than they were, perhaps drive a car fast or drink and drive, something along those lines, because they're not able to consider risks and, make proper decisions. No, I'm not being shady. I'm just saying. Okay, language. Language processing is complex and bilateral, but occurs more in centers in the left hemisphere. There are two areas that are associated with language that I would like you to learn for your future clinical work, because these areas, if damaged by a stroke, let's say, leave the person with language deficits that can often be extremely difficult for the person and for the people that care about the person. So Wernicke's area is associated with language comprehension, and it is near the auditory cortex, fittingly. Okay? It is the pink circle in the left picture, and if you compare it to the auditory cortex, you see that they are right next to each other, even on top of each other. So this, if damaged, would mean that the person doesn't understand what people are saying to them. They can see their friends or family's mouth moving, but they cannot comprehend the language that the people are speaking. They can't understand what's being said. It's really sad, right? Then Broca's area is associated with speech production, and it is near the motor cortex. If you look there, it is actually, quite close to the primary motor cortex. And this causes a kind of a broken speech, I think of it, Broca's area, broken speech, where the person means to say one thing and says a vastly different thing. All right. So they might be trying to say the papers are on the table, and they'll say the shoes are on the hamburger or something, like they just like everything's all scrambled up. So that's a problem too, and it's very frustrating for the people. Hemispheric lateralization. The two hemispheres of the brain perform slightly different functions. This is called hemispheric lateralization. The right hemisphere has areas for recognizing faces, familiar places, and familiar objects. It's active in comprehending spatial relationships, and it's active in processing nonverbal information. The left hemisphere is associated with language. It's active in math calculations, time and sequence processing, what happened first, what happened second, logic and analytical thinking. 90% of people are right-handed with hand movements controlled by the left hemisphere. However, truly, both sides of the brain work together. And, people have really talked a lot about, people being right-brained or people being left-brained. People have written books about it, articles, like popular articles, I mean. But it's not really true. The idea that people are right-brained, meaning that they're creative and intuitive, or left-brained, meaning that they're analytical and logical, is not true, as it turns out. They've done studies, and people use both sides of their brain, even to engage in the functions that are known scientifically to occur more on one side than the other. Okay, now the cerebellum. The cerebellum is posterior to the brainstem and inferior to the cerebrum. It's connected to the pons by the cerebral peduncles, superior, middle, and inferior, that I talked about when I talked about the pons. There are sensory and motor axons that are passing through the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellum has a right and a left hemisphere that is separated by a band of cortex called the vermis or worm. The vermis is on the posterior exterior of the cerebellum. It's not hidden inside or anything. Um, the surface of the cerebellum is formed of highly folded cerebellar cortex. The folds are called folia, and you could think of them as little tiny gyri and sulci. They're just, itsy bitsy folds. And they're there for the same reason that the gyri are there, to increase the surface area of the cerebellum, just the way that the gyri and sulci increase the surface area of the cerebrum. All right, there are cerebellar gray and white matter areas. The cerebellar cortex and cerebellar nuclei are the gray matter areas that contain cell bodies. And there are myelinated axons under the cortex that form what's called an arbor vitae, or tree of life pattern. So you can see, if you look carefully at the second picture, there's gray or tan looking cerebellar cortex. And then inside, a little harder to see, are the cerebellar nuclei. Okay, little clumps of cell bodies. And then the arbor vitae, they named it so poetically, the tree of life, because it does look a bit like a tree if you look at the white matter. Okay, the function of the cerebellum. The cerebellum receives proprioceptive sensory input from the spinal cord and inner ear, and also visual, auditory, and touch sensory input. The cerebellum exerts subconscious control of voluntary and involuntary movements on the ipsilateral side of the body, based on sensory inputs and also on memories of learned movements, like riding a bike or something, or playing the piano. The cerebellum coordinates movements and makes automatic adjustments to posture to maintain balance. It performs its functions indirectly by modifying activity in other motor tracts. It does not initiate motor movements. Okay, clinical correlation. Dysfunction of the cerebellum causes a loss of muscle coordination called ataxia, and ataxia may appear as an unsteady gait and slurred speech. Acute alcohol intoxication, which occurs at a blood alcohol level of about 0.08%, causes cerebellar ataxia. So we've all seen a person who was drunk, in common parlance, have an unsteady gait and slurred speech. And that is because alcohol has a toxic effect on the neurons in the cerebellum. I mean, temporary. Your body is able to clear alcohol. Okay.